Eli Cohen was, for a few short years in the early 1960s, one of the most trusted men in the capital of a country that would have executed him on sight if they had known what he truly was. And eventually, when they found out, that is exactly what they did. He was a charming man, warm and generous and easy to like, the kind of guest a host is glad to see, and a lonely official is grateful to befriend. He threw the best parties in Damascus. He gave the most thoughtful gifts. He listened better than anyone in the room, and he remembered what you told him. And he made you feel, in the way only a certain kind of man can, that your troubles were his troubles and your secrets were safe with him. Generals confided in him. Politicians courted his opinion. He was driven to the front lines of the Golan Heights as an honored friend of the army and shown the fortifications that guarded Syria against Israel. And the officers who showed him were proud to do it because Kamel Amin Thaabet was a patriot, a wealthy son of Syria returned from abroad to serve his homeland, a man whose loyalty no one in Damascus ever thought to question. But Kamel Amin Thaabet did not exist. He had never existed. He was a costume, a legend, a carefully constructed fiction worn by a man named Eli Cohen, who was not a Syrian patriot at all, but an agent of Israeli intelligence. A Jew, an Israeli, an enemy sitting at the very heart of the enemy's power, eating their food and holding their confidences and memorizing everything he saw and heard so that he could send it in bursts of Morse code from a radio hidden in his apartment to the country they most wanted to destroy. And here is the thing that makes his story worth telling, the paradox at the center of it. The most valuable spy Israel ever placed in the Arab world succeeded precisely because he made himself beloved. He did not steal secrets by breaking into safes or bribing clerks. He was handed them freely, gladly, by men who considered him a dear friend because he had made himself so charming, so useful, so completely one of them that telling him the nation's secrets felt not like a betrayal, but like conversation among brothers. He climbed so high in Damascus that some accounts say there was talk of a government post for him, a place in the corridors of Syrian power. The enemy nearly promoted their own destroyer. And that same gift for being loved, that same relentless drive that took him to the summit, was the thing that would not let him stop when he should have, and it carried him step by step all the way to a rope in a public square. To understand how a man ends up hanging before a cheering crowd in the heart of Damascus, you have to go back to a boy in Alexandria, in a religious household, in a world that was about to tell every Jew in the Arab lands that they no longer belonged. Eliyahu Cohen was born in December of 1924 in Alexandria, Egypt, into a Syrian Jewish family that had come down from the ancient community of Aleppo. His people were pious and hard-working and rooted in a world that felt at the time permanent. The Jews of the Arab cities, Alexandria, Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, were not newcomers. They had lived among their Muslim and Christian neighbors for centuries, spoke the same Arabic, ate the same food, moved through the same streets, and considered those cities their home as much as anyone's. Eli grew up in that world. He was an Arab Jew in the fullest sense, fluent in Arabic and in the customs and rhythms of Egyptian life, indistinguishable on the street from any other young man of Alexandria. He was devout, raised in the traditions of his family, and he was clever, good with his mind, good with machines, drawn to study. He enrolled to study electronics and engineering, and by every ordinary measure he was headed for an ordinary and respectable life as an educated man in the city of his birth. But the ground was shifting under him, and under every Jew in the region, faster than any of them wanted to believe. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the war that followed turned the ancient Jewish communities of the Arab world, almost overnight, from neighbors into suspects. In Egypt, as elsewhere, the mood curdled. There were arrests, confiscations, mob violence, a growing official hostility that made it clear the long story of Jewish life in the Arab cities was ending. Young Eli Cohen, watching this happen to his own community, did what many idealistic young Jews of his generation did. He was drawn toward Zionism, toward the idea of the new Jewish state, toward the work of helping his people get out and get to safety. He became involved in the clandestine networks that smuggled Egyptian Jews to Israel, in the quiet, dangerous work of moving people and information under the eyes of a hostile government. That work put him for the first time in the orbit of Israeli intelligence. In the early 1950s, Israeli operatives were active in Egypt, and the line between a committed young Zionist activist and an intelligence asset was a thin and blurry one. Cohen moved in those circles when an Israeli sabotage operation in Egypt collapsed catastrophically in 1954. A bungled affair that ended with Egyptian Jews arrested, tried, and in some cases executed as spies. The crackdown swept up many on the fringes of the networks. Cohen was interrogated. By some accounts, he was suspected, questioned, and released for lack of evidence. The Egyptians had their hands on a man who would one day become Israel's greatest spy, and they let him go because at that moment he was only a young man on the edges of something, not yet the thing he would become. It is worth pausing on that moment because it planted something in him. A man who's been arrested as a spy and released, who has felt the hand of a hostile state close around him and then improbably let go, is changed by it. He has looked over the edge. Some men, having survived such a thing, spend the rest of their lives avoiding the edge ever again. A rarer kind is drawn back to it, because they have learned that they can stand there and not fall, that they have the nerve for the work, that the fear did not master them. Which kind Eli Cohen was, the years would reveal. But the seed was there already in Alexandria, a young man who had touched the secret world, been burned by it, and walked away not cured of it, but marked by it, carrying a quiet knowledge of what he could endure. And he was watching his whole world end. That is the part that is easy to forget from a distance of decades. That the Jews of the Arab cities were not leaving a foreign land, but being driven from their own homes, from cities their families had lived in for centuries, from the only life they had ever known. The Alexandria of Eli Cohen's boyhood, cosmopolitan and layered and old, was closing its doors to him and his kind, and the closing was not gentle. Property was seized, livelihoods vanished. Neighbors of a lifetime turned wary or hostile. A whole civilization of Arab Jewry, spread across the region, was being dismantled in the span of a few short years, its people scattering to Israel, to Europe, to the Americas, carrying nothing but what they could take. Eli Cohen lived that dismantling personally, and a man who has been made a stranger in his own city, who has been taught by force that he does not belong where he was born, carries a particular fuel inside him, a conviction that his people need a country of their own where this can never be done to them again, and a willingness, if asked, to pay a great deal for it. But his time in Egypt was running out. After the Suez Crisis of 1956, Egypt expelled great numbers of its Jews, and Eli Cohen, marked and unwelcome, was forced out of the country of his birth. In 1957, he arrived in Israel, a new immigrant in the new state, an educated, capable, multilingual man who had already risked himself for the Zionist cause, arriving into a country that did not quite know what to do with him. The first thing Israel did with Eli Cohen was overlook him. This is one of the quiet ironies of his story. The man who would become the most celebrated spy in his nation's history began his life in that nation as a filing clerk. He took ordinary work, an accountant, a clerk, a translator, an insurance office job, the modest employment of a new immigrant finding his feet. He had approached Israeli intelligence. He wanted to serve, wanted to be an operative, believed he had the gifts for it. And Israeli intelligence, for a time, said no. There are accounts that he was assessed and turned down, judged perhaps too eager, or not the right fit, or simply not needed. He worked for a while as a translator or analyst on the edges of the intelligence world, close to the work, but not in it, and then even that fell away, and he was, by the end of the 1950s, an ordinary married man with an ordinary job, his ambitions filed away in a drawer, because he had married by then. Her name was Nadia, a young woman of Iraqi Jewish background, and they built the beginnings of an ordinary life together in Israel, and they would have children. Eli Cohen, the family man, the clerk, the quiet neighbor. That was a real man too. not a cover. And it is important to hold on to him because everything that came later would be measured against what it cost this man and this family. And then Israeli intelligence changed its mind. In the tense years around 1960, as the young state watched its Arab neighbors with the permanent anxiety of a country that had already fought for its survival and expected to fight again, the intelligence services needed exactly the kind of man they had earlier passed over, someone who could pass flawlessly as an Arab. Someone fluent, not just in the language, but in the soul of Arab society. Someone brave, disciplined, and quick, with the nerve to live a lie in the enemy's house. They came back to Eli Cohen. This time they recruited him, and the ordinary clerk who had been told he was not wanted was pulled at last into the secret world he had ached to enter, not knowing that the door he was so glad to walk through opened onto a road with a rope at the end of it. What kind of man says yes to that? A man of conviction, certainly. Cohen believed in Israel, believed in the cause he had already risked himself for in Egypt, but also, one suspects, a man who needed to matter, who had been overlooked and underused, and now was being told that he, specifically he, could do something no one else could. That hunger to be exceptional is a powerful thing. It makes great spies. It also sometimes makes dead ones. And there was the particular value the service saw in him, which no amount of training can manufacture in an ordinary recruit. Israel in those years could train men in tradecraft, in codes, in weapons, in the mechanics of clandestine life, but it could not train a European-born Israeli to be an Arab, to move through Damascus or Cairo without the thousand tiny tells that give a foreigner away, the wrong gesture over coffee, the half-beat hesitation at a proverb, the accent that is almost but not quite right. Eli Cohen did not have to learn any of that. He had lived it from birth. Arabic was his mother tongue, Arab life his native element. He knew in his body how a man of that world stood, joked, prayed, bargained, mourned, and boasted. He was, in the cold language of the trade, a natural cover for the Arab world in a way that could not be built from scratch. And men like that were rare and precious. The service that had once turned him away now understood exactly what it had almost let slip, a weapon that could only ever be found, never made. So they took the clerk and began, patiently, to remake him, not into an Arab, for that he already was, but into something far more dangerous, an Arab who was also a disciplined, invisible instrument of Israeli intelligence, capable of living a total lie for years at a stretch, with a rope always waiting at the far end of the mistake he must never make. The training itself was long and merciless, and most of it had nothing to do with guns. He was drilled in radio operation and Morse code until he could tap out and read the dots and dashes under pressure, in the dark at speed, because the radio would be his lifeline and his death sentence both. He was taught encryption, the making and breaking of codes, the discipline of secret writing. He was schooled in the arts of memory so that he could carry away the contents of a document or a conversation without ever writing a note that could betray him. He was taught surveillance and counter-surveillance, how to tell if he was being followed, how to lose a tail without appearing to try, how to service a dead drop, how to behave in the 1,000 small moments when a spy is most exposed. And above all, he was drilled over and over in his legend, the biography of Kamel Amin Thaabet, every detail of a life that had never been lived, until Cohen could answer any question about his invented past instantly, without thought, the way a man answers questions about his real childhood. A legend that must be recalled is a legend that fails. It has to be reflexive, bone deep, so automatic that even exhaustion or fear or drink cannot shake it loose. They built that into him until the false life sat as easily on him as the true one. They trained him, and they built him a new self to wear, and the self they built was a masterpiece. He was to become Kamel Amin Thaabet, sometimes rendered Thaabet, a Syrian born in Beirut, raised abroad, the son of a family that had emigrated to Argentina. This was the crucial architecture of the legend. Cohen would not simply appear in Damascus claiming to be Syrian. That would invite questions no cover could survive. Instead, he would come home to Syria as a prosperous member of the Syrian expatriate community, a successful businessman who had made good in South America, and now, out of patriotism and longing, wished to return to the motherland. It was a legend built to explain everything a Syrian might find unusual about him. Any slight difference in accent or manner could be waved away as the mark of a man raised among the emigrants of Buenos Aires. And so, before he ever set foot in Damascus, Eli Cohen went to Argentina. This is the part of the craft that outsiders never appreciate, the enormous, patient, unglamorous work of manufacturing a past. He arrived in Buenos Aires in 1961 and spent months there doing nothing but becoming Kamel Amin Thaabet. He established himself among the Arab immigrant community of Argentina, a large, wealthy, politically active world of Syrians and Lebanese who had prospered abroad and kept passionate ties to home. He set up a plausible import-export business. He cultivated a reputation as a rich, generous, well-connected Syrian patriot. He made friends. Crucially, he made friends who mattered, men connected to the political and military elite of Syria itself, expatriates and visitors who moved between Buenos Aires and Damascus. By the time he was finished, Kamel Amin Thaabet was not a claim on a passport. He was a man with a history, a circle, a reputation, and letters of introduction. A Syrian the Syrians already vouched for, ready to be received home with open arms. The most important of the friendships he made in that South American exile was with the men who carried Syria's politics abroad with them. The Arab émigré community of Buenos Aires was not merely a social world. It was threaded through with the passions and factions of the homeland. And among the people Kamel Amin Thaabet cultivated were figures tied to the Syrian military and to the Ba'ath movement that was rising toward power back home. By one well-known account, he grew close in Argentina to a Syrian military attaché, a man who would later rise to the very top of the Syrian state, so that when Cohen eventually appeared in Damascus, he came trailing not just vague goodwill, but personal connections to men on their way up. This is the deepest art of legend building, not to fake a past, but to acquire, in advance and by the front door, the real relationships that will open the real doors later. By the time he left Argentina, Kamel Amin Thaabet was vouched for by people whose word carried weight in Damascus. And the vouching was genuine because the people doing it genuinely believed in him. Think of the patience that required. Most of us, asked to pretend to be someone else, could hold it for an evening, a dinner party, a border crossing. Eli Cohen held it for months in Argentina before the mission proper had even begun, living every waking hour as Kamel Amin Thaabet, thinking as him, drinking with strangers as him, building a business and a name and a circle as him. With no radio to send home yet, no secrets to steal yet, nothing to show for it but the slow accumulation of a believable self. It was all foundation, all groundwork, the invisible substructure on which everything later would stand. A lesser man would have rushed it. Cohen laid every stone. It worked so well that when he finally moved to Damascus in early 1962, he arrived not as a stranger to be checked, but as a returning son to be welcomed, carrying the goodwill of the émigré community and the recommendations of men the Damascus establishment respected. The costume was seamless, the legend held. And Eli Cohen, filing clerk of Tel Aviv, walked into the capital of Israel's most implacable enemy as one of its own. Try for a moment to feel the weight of that crossing. Behind him lay a wife, small children, a real name, a real face, a country that could speak of him only in whispers and would have to deny him if he fell. Ahead lay a city where his true identity was a death sentence, where every man he would befriend was a man who would hang him if he knew, where he would live for years without a single soul near him who knew who he really was. In Damascus, there would be no one to be Eli Cohen with. No wife's shorthand, no mother tongue of the heart, no moment of dropping the guard. There would be only Kamel Amin Thaabet all day and all night, at the parties and in the empty apartment alike. The performance never ending because the audience never left. Most people could not endure a week of that solitude of the self, that permanent exile inside a false skin. Cohen chose to live in it for his country, knowing what it would cost and what it might cost. And he walked through the gate of that choice with a smile on his face and a rope somewhere in his future. And he did not look back. Once inside Damascus, he did the most audacious thing a spy can do. He did not hide, he shone. The conventional image of a spy is a man who disappears into the shadows, who avoids attention, who makes himself small. Eli Cohen understood that in his situation, the opposite was his only protection. A quiet, solitary foreigner is a man people wonder about. A loud, lavish, generous, beloved socialite at the center of the city's life is a man no one suspects because suspicion attaches to those who hide. And Kamel Amin Thaabet hid nothing. He was the most visible man in the room. So he rented a fine apartment conveniently located near sensitive government and military buildings, and he turned it into the most sought-after private salon in Damascus. He threw parties, extravagant ones, with the finest food and drink, and he invited the powerful army officers, government officials, Ba'ath party figures, journalists, businessmen, and they came again and again because his hospitality was legendary and his company was a delight. And there, in the warm haze of those evenings, men talked. This was the genius of the whole operation, and it is worth understanding because it explains how so much flowed to him. Powerful men, relaxed among friends, flattered by a generous host, competitive with one another, love to talk, to hint at what they know, to display their importance, to complain about their superiors, to boast about the army's strength or grumble about its weakness. Cohen never had to interrogate anyone. He only had to pour the drinks, ask the right gentle question, and listen. He was a superb listener, and he had a memory like a vault. An officer would mention a troop movement. A politician would let slip a plan. A Ba'athist would reveal the shifting alignments of the coup-prone Syrian government. And Kamel Amin Thaabet would smile and nod and file it away, and later alone he would encode it and send it home. He gave as much as he took, which was the secret engine of the whole thing. A man who only extracts is soon felt as a leech and avoided. A man who gives favors, introductions, money, generosity, attention becomes indispensable, and people bring their secrets to the indispensable man freely to keep his favor. Cohen made himself indispensable. He helped people. He solved their small problems, lent his connections, remembered their children's names and their wives' illnesses, was there with the right word and the right gift at the right moment. He became, to the powerful men of Damascus, not a source to be guarded against, but a friend to be relied upon. And there is no better position from which to steal a nation's secrets than the position of the trusted friend. The information did not feel, to the men who gave it, like something being taken. It felt like the ordinary confidences of friendship. That was the whole art of him. He did not break into the vault of Syrian secrets. He was invited in and handed the key, and thanked for coming. Consider the nerve it took to live that way, every single day, for years. Every guest at every party was a potential executioner. Any one of those relaxed, laughing officials could, with a single suspicious question or an idle background check that went one layer too deep, unravel the whole thing and send Cohen to the gallows. He could never fully relax, never let the mask slip for an instant, never allow himself to be truly drunk, however much wine he poured for others, never talk in his sleep in the wrong language, never react to a piece of news as an Israeli would rather than as a Syrian patriot should. He lived inside a performance that could not pause, surrounded by people who would kill him if the performance ever faltered. And he did it not for a night or a week, but for years, smiling, generous, warm, the perfect host he. While underneath the smile, a second mind ran constantly cataloging, memorizing, calculating what to send home and how. The strain of that kind of sustained deception is difficult to imagine. It hollows men out. That Cohen not only survived it, but flourished in it, made himself the most popular man in the room night after night, speaks to a coldness of nerve and a warmth of manner, coexisting in one person in a way that is genuinely rare. He rose astonishingly fast. He became close to men at the very top of Syrian power. He befriended senior military officers and political figures, some of whom would rise even higher in the turbulent, coup-ridden politics of Syria in those years. He was so trusted, so well regarded, that doors opened for him that were closed to almost everyone. And here we reach the most famous and most dangerous part of his access. Cohen was taken as an honored civilian friend of the army on tours of the Syrian military fortifications on the Golan Heights, the high ground from which Syria menaced the Israeli farms and settlements in the valley below. Officers proud of their defenses showed him the bunkers, the gun positions, the layout of the front. He walked the very ground from which Syria planned to fight Israel, escorted by the men who would defend it, and he memorized all of it. To grasp why this access was worth a man's life, you have to understand the geography of fear it touched. The Golan Heights are high ground, a wall of rock and plateau rising over the Sea of Galilee and the Israeli farmland in the valley below. From those heights, Syrian guns could and did shell Israeli farmers at their work, and from those heights, in any future war, a Syrian army would pour down toward the heart of northern Israel. To Israel, the Golan was the loaded gun pointed at its head, and the single most valuable thing an Israeli spy could possibly bring home was the precise, detailed knowledge of how that gun was built, where the bunkers sat, how the trenches ran, where the artillery was dug in, how the defenses were laid out and manned. This was the intelligence that could turn a bloody, uncertain assault into a swift and surgical one that could save the lives of the young Israeli soldiers who would one day have to take that ground. And Eli Cohen, escorted as an honored guest, was walking the length of that loaded gun with his hosts pointing out each part of the mechanism and carrying every detail of it home in his head. There is a story about those visits, one of the most repeated in the whole legend, and it deserves to be told with the caution it warrants because it may be more parable than fact. The story goes that Cohen, seeing the Syrian soldiers baking in the sun at their exposed positions, suggested to his military friends that they plant eucalyptus trees at each fortification to give the men shade, a thoughtful gesture from a caring patriot. And the Syrians, the story says, did it, so that years later, when war came, Israeli pilots and gunners could find the hidden Syrian positions instantly by looking for the telltale clusters of trees. Whether this literally happened as told, historians debate. It has the too perfect shape of legend, but it captures something true about the method of the man, that his help was a weapon, that the very trust he inspired was turned against those who gave it, that a suggestion offered as friendship could be aimed like a rifle. What did all of it add up to, and why did it matter so much? It mattered because Cohen was not sending gossip. He was sending, over months and years, a detailed and current picture of Syria's military posture, its political convulsions, its intentions toward Israel, and its plans for the border. He reported on the Syrian order of battle, the disposition of forces, the fortifications of the Golan. He reported on the internal politics of a country that in those years lurched from coup to coup, so that Israel understood the shifting balance of power in Damascus better at times than many Syrians did. And he reported on one issue of enormous strategic weight, the Arab plan to divert the headwaters of the Jordan River, to choke off the water on which Israel's survival depended. Water in that arid land was life and death, and the intelligence Cohen provided on Syrian and Arab water diversion schemes fed directly into Israeli decisions about how to respond to what Israel regarded as an existential threat. The political reporting may have been just as valuable as the military, and it came from a rarer vantage still. Syria in the early 1960s was one of the most unstable states in the world, a country that churned through coups and counter-coups, where governments rose and fell by the ambitions of army officers and the maneuvering of Ba'athist factions, where the man on top this season might be in a cell or in exile's grave the next. For an outside power trying to understand Syria, this was a fogman who really held power, who was rising, who was plotting against whom, which faction the army would follow if the shooting started. Eli Cohen sat inside that fog with a lamp. Because his friends were the very officers and politicians whose rivalries decided everything, he could report not just what the government said, but what was actually happening beneath it. The alignments, the resentments, the coming shifts. There were seasons when Israel understood the true balance of power in Damascus better than the average Syrian minister did, because Israel had a man at the dinner tables where the power actually changed hands. To read the internal politics of your enemy that clearly is to be able to anticipate him, and anticipation in the deadly arithmetic of that border was worth more than any number of guns. And the danger of that access cut both ways. To sit close to men who were themselves conspiring in a country where today's confidant could be tomorrow's condemned traitor meant Cohen had to navigate not only the risk of exposure as a foreign spy, but the ordinary lethal turbulence of Syrian politics, to stay friendly with rising men without being dragged down when they fell, to be everyone's friend and no one's faction, to survive the very coups he reported on. That he threaded that needle for years, remaining welcome and trusted through changes of regime that sent other men to prison or the wall, is its own quiet marvel of nerve and judgment. The information flowed home in bursts of Morse code, tapped out from a radio transmitter hidden in his Damascus apartment, and received by Israeli intelligence. Between transmissions, there were also trips. Cohen would travel out of Syria, ostensibly on business, and make his way to Europe, and secretly home to Israel, to be debriefed at length, to see his handlers, and to see Nadia and his children. These homecomings were the human heart of the operation, and, as we will see, a piece of its undoing. Each time he was the doting husband and father for a precious stretch of days, and then Kamel Amin Thaabet would reassemble himself and go back into the lion's mouth. And here the story turns quietly toward its human cost, because there was a woman in Tel Aviv who knew almost nothing and feared almost everything. Nadia understood that her husband did secret work for the state, that he traveled for long stretches, that she could not ask where or why. She did not know he was in Damascus. She did not know he was living under another man's name in the capital of the enemy. That the charming Syrian businessman the newspapers would one day describe was her own quiet Eli. She knew only the shape of the absences and the joy of the returns. The husband who came home laden with gifts, who was tender and present, and then, always too soon, gone again on another journey he could not explain. She raised their children through his absences. She lived on the edges of a secret she was not permitted to see the middle of, and she made, without ever being asked in plain words, the sacrifice that the wives of such men always make. A marriage lived in fragments, a life built around a locked door. There are accounts that Nadia sensed, toward the end, that something was wrong, that the visits were harder, that her husband seemed to carry a weight he would not name, that she asked him not to go back and that he went anyway. Whether or not those memories have been polished by grief and hindsight, they point at a truth that sits at the center of this whole story, that Eli Cohen kept returning to Damascus long past the point where a safe man would have stopped. Each homecoming was a chance to stay, to be pulled out, to become an ordinary father again. Each time he went back, something in him, duty, conviction, the pull of unfinished work, the intoxication of being the most important man no one could know about, carried him back through the door and into the mouth of the lion. One time, too many. For roughly 3 years this continued, and in those years, Eli Cohen gave Israel an intelligence advantage over Syria that is difficult to overstate. Israeli commanders would draw on his reporting for years, and its value would become spectacularly evident later in the decade when Israel took the Golan Heights in a matter of hours, with a precision that owed something to knowing the ground in advance. That is worth dwelling on, because it is where the abstract worth of a spy becomes concrete in blood and terrain. When war came in June of 1967, the Golan Heights, that fortress wall of bunkers and trenches and dug-in guns, was one of the hardest objectives Israel faced, ground that by every rule of warfare should have cost an attacker dearly to take. Israel took it, and took it fast, storming the heights and breaking the Syrian defenses in a swift and brutal assault. No single source wins a battle, and it would be too simple to hang that victory on one man. But the soldiers who went up those slopes went up against positions that had, in a real sense, already been mapped, a defensive system that Israeli planners had studied in part through the eyes of a man who had walked it as an honored guest years before. Every bunker whose location was known in advance was a place where fewer young men had to die discovering it. That is the true currency of what Cohen did. It was never really about documents or dinner party gossip. It was about the lives that intelligence saves when the shooting finally starts. Lives on the Israeli side, bought with the life of the man who gathered the knowledge in one of the cruelest and most honest exchanges that the business of nations ever makes. But there is a cruel arithmetic in the life of a deep cover agent, and Eli Cohen was living against it. Every day inside is a day the odds accumulate against you. Every transmission is a signal that can be traced. Every party is a chance for one wrong word. The longer a spy stays, the more he gathers, and the more likely he is to be caught. A disciplined service knows when to pull an agent out, when the risk has grown past the reward. The question that hangs over the end of Eli Cohen's story, and has hung over it ever since, is whether he and the people running him pushed that arithmetic too far. Because the net was closing, and it was closing for a reason that had nothing to do with any mistake at Cohen's parties, his weakness was not his manner or his cover, it was his radio. To send intelligence home, Cohen had to transmit, and every transmission was a burst of energy going out from a specific point in Damascus at a specific time, and a burst of energy can be found by anyone with the right equipment and the patience to hunt for it. This is the oldest vulnerability in the trade. A spy who never communicates is safe and useless. A spy who communicates can be located by the very signals that make him valuable, and by the mid-1960s, the hunters had the equipment. There is a bitter irony buried in this, and it is worth naming. Everything that made Eli Cohen safe, his charm, his cover, his flawless Arabic, the genuine love of the men around him, was human, and no human in Damascus ever saw through it. The mask never failed. He was not undone by a slip at a party or a rival's suspicion or a jealous enemy. He was undone by physics. Radio waves do not care how charming a man is. A transmitter is a point in space shouting into the air on a schedule. And given enough patient listening and the right machines, a point in space can always, eventually, be found. The very tool that made Cohen valuable. The link that carried his gold home to Israel was the one part of his operation that no amount of personal genius could disguise, and it was there, in the invisible spectrum above the rooftops of Damascus, that the hunt for him was quietly won. The Syrians, it is widely believed, had help. The Soviet Union, Syria's patron and arms supplier, provided technical assistance and, by many accounts, sophisticated radio direction finding equipment and expertise. The tools to detect and triangulate clandestine transmissions. There had been signs for some time that an unauthorized transmitter was operating in Damascus, sending regular encoded messages out of the country. Suspicion grew that a spy was at work in the heart of the capital. And so the hunt began. Mobile detection units moving through the city, listening, narrowing, triangulating, closing the ring block by block on the source of the signals. Some accounts say the transmissions were interfering with other communications and drew attention that way. Others emphasize the methodical Soviet-assisted direction finding. Either way, the invisible thing that made Cohen dangerous had begun at last to give him away. And here, the human factor and the technical factor met. To keep his handlers supplied and perhaps pressed by the pace of events, Cohen was transmitting on a schedule, regular enough to be predictable. And predictability is death for a clandestine operator. The hunters could anticipate when to listen. This is the oldest trap in the business, and every trained operator knows it, and it caught Cohen anyway, which tells you something about how the pressures of the work erode even the best discipline. A spy who sends at random, at irregular hours from changing locations, is enormously hard to find. A spy who sends often at fixed times from the same room is only a matter of patience for the hunters. The demands of the mission, the sheer volume of valuable material Cohen was gathering, the appetite of his handler for it, perhaps his own drive to deliver, pushed him toward a rhythm of transmission that made him findable. The intelligence was so good that getting it home became a compulsion, and the compulsion became a pattern, and the pattern became a noose. In the early hours of a January morning in 1965, the direction finders closed on his apartment. The hunters had narrowed the search to a district, then a block, then a building, And now they simply waited for the transmission they knew was coming and moved on it while it was still in the air. Syrian security burst in and caught Eli Cohen at his radio, in the very act of transmitting to Israel the code books and equipment there for all to see. There was no moment to hide anything, no time to swallow a page or smash a set. He was taken mid-signal, his hand on the key, the evidence glowing around him in the single worst way for a spy to be caught, with the crime not merely suspected, but happening in front of the men who seized him. Everything he had built, the friendships, the reputation, the trust of generals and ministers, collapsed in an instant into its opposite. The men who had loved Kamel Amin Thaabet now understood that they had been played, humiliated, penetrated at the highest level by the enemy they hated most, and their fury was absolute. The most trusted man in Damascus became, overnight, the most reviled. What followed was brutal, and it was public, and it was meant to be both. Cohen was interrogated harshly, tortured by all accounts, as the Syrians tried to learn everything: how he had operated, what he had sent, who had helped him, how deep the penetration went. He was made to transmit to Israel under Syrian control in an attempt to feed false information back or to lure and expose his handlers, though the Israelis reading the messages understood from what was and wasn't there that their man was taken. There is a quiet horror in that detail worth pausing on. The same key, the same hand, the same call sign that had carried 3 years of secrets home to Tel Aviv, now tapping out words dictated by his captors, a captured instrument turned around and aimed back at the people it had served. Between trained operators, there are always small signatures, a rhythm, a phrasing, an expected code word present or absent. And by these, the men in Israel could read the truth beneath the forced messages, that the voice on the other end was no longer free, that the operation was blown, that the friend at the far end of the wire was in enemy hands and beyond their reach. It is one thing to lose an agent. It is another to sit in a listening room and hear his captured hand on the key and know exactly what it means, and be able to do nothing at all. Then he was put on trial before a military tribunal. The outcome was never in doubt. Syria had suffered a national humiliation, and it wanted a reckoning that the whole Arab world would see. There's something almost unbearable in the position Cohen occupied in those weeks, and it is worth sitting with. The men interrogating and condemning him included, or answered to, some of the very people who had counted Kamel Amin Thaabet a friend, who had welcomed him into their homes, confided in him, been photographed smiling at his side. Their humiliation was total and personal humiliation makes for merciless judges. This was not the cold, procedural handling of a captured enemy soldier. It was the rage of men who had been made fools of at the highest level by someone they had loved and trusted, and who now needed to destroy him utterly to answer the wound to their pride and their nations. Every kindness Cohen had shown them, every gift and party and confidence, had become, in retrospect, an insult, and they meant to repay it in full. Israel and much of the world tried to save him. There were appeals for clemency, quiet diplomatic efforts, and public ones, pleas from governments and from the Pope and from human rights figures, offers, it is said, of money and prisoners and medicine in exchange for his life. Nadia, his wife, pleaded for him, but Syria was not to be moved. To spare the spy would be to diminish the humiliation and the vengeance. To hang him publicly would be to answer the shame with the spectacle of Syrian justice and Syrian power. The tribunal condemned Eli Cohen to death on the 18th of May, 1965, in Marja Square in the center of Damascus, a square whose very name in Syrian history is bound up with the execution of enemies of the state. Eli Cohen was hanged in public before a large crowd, the event broadcast for the nation to witness. He was dressed in a white shroud on which his supposed crimes were written. He was permitted, it is said, to send a last message to his wife, a few words of love and farewell, a letter in which, by the accounts that have come down, he asked her to forgive him, to look after their children, to go on living, and even to remarry and not to spend her life in mourning. Whatever its exact words, it was the message of a man who knew he was about to die for what he had chosen, reaching across the border one final time toward the only life that had ever truly been his own. And then, the man who had climbed to the summit of Damascus society was hanged in its central square as its lowest criminal, and his body was left suspended for hours so that all could see what became of those who spied against Syria. The spectacle was the point of it. This was not a quiet execution in a prison yard at dawn. It was a public rite, staged in the most symbolic square in the capital before a crowd carried to the nation. Syria had been humiliated by this man in the most intimate way. A state can be humiliated, penetrated at its own dinner tables, and it answered the private betrayal with the most public possible vengeance. A body hanging in the heart of Damascus for the whole Arab world to see. Proof that Syria had found the enemy in its midst and destroyed him. A warning written in a human figure against the sky. There is a terrible completeness to it. The man whose entire craft had been to be seen, to shine, to be the most visible and beloved man in every room, was made visible one last time in the worst way imaginable. No longer the celebrated host, but the displayed corpse. His fame turned inside out. The crowd that would once have flocked to his parties now gathered to watch him die. He was 40 years old. He left Nadia a widow and his 3 young children fatherless. And Syria, in a final cruelty that would outlast the man himself, refused to give his body back. It was buried in a secret place, moved, so the story goes, to keep it from Israeli hands, and despite more than half a century of pleading and searching and negotiating by his family and his country, the remains of Eli Cohen have never been returned. His widow campaigned for decades for the right to bury her husband. It never came. Long after his death, in a small mercy that only underlined the larger cruelty, Israeli intelligence managed to recover his wristwatch and bring it home. A single object, a scrap of a man, standing in for the body Syria would not release. Think of what that withholding has meant, stretched across the decades. A widow who was a young woman when her husband was hanged grew old still asking for his bones, still lobbying governments and pleading with intermediaries and hoping into her later years for a grave she could finally visit. Children who lost their father as small children became adults, and then middle-aged with no place to lay a stone. No plot in the earth to say, here he lies. Only the knowledge that their father's body was somewhere in Syrian ground, moved and hidden precisely so that they could never have it. A nation turned Eli Cohen into a national hero, named streets and squares and schools for him, told and retold his story, made his face familiar to generations. And yet for all its power could not do the one thing his family most wanted, which was to bring him home to rest. The state that sent him could not recover him. The enemy that killed him would not release him. And so he remains, more than half a century on, a hero without a grave, honored everywhere, and buried nowhere his own people can reach. The final unhealed wound of a story full of wounds. That is the shape of what he gave and of what was taken. It is a long way from a filing desk in Tel Aviv to a hidden grave in Damascus, and Eli Cohen traveled the whole of it in a handful of years, giving his country an advantage it would draw on for a generation, and giving his family a grief that has never ended. And so we come to the 2 ways of seeing Eli Cohen, and they are as far apart as any 2 readings of a single life can be. In the first, he is a hero without qualification, one of the greatest spies of the 20th century and a genuine architect of his nation's survival. In this telling, everything is vindicated by the stakes and the results. Israel was a young country ringed by enemies who spoke openly of destroying it. And Eli Cohen, alone and unarmed in the enemy's capital, gathered the knowledge that helped keep it alive. The fortifications that would be stormed, the water plans that would be countered, the politics that would be understood. He did it out of pure conviction, at total risk, asking nothing, and he paid for it with unspeakable courage on the gallows of Marjay Square. He is a martyr and a master, his name a byword in his country for devotion, the ordinary clerk who became the extraordinary shield of his people. Streets bear his name. His face is on stamps and screens. In this reading, the only tragedy is that such a man was lost, and the only shame belongs to the country that killed him and still cruelly holds his bones. In the second reading, the picture is more complicated and more human, and it does not erase the heroism but stands beside it. In this telling, Eli Cohen was also a man who was pushed and who pushed himself past the point of safety, kept in the field too long, transmitting too regularly, running risks that a colder calculation would never have permitted until the arithmetic of exposure caught him, as it was always going to. There are those who have asked, ever since, whether his handlers should have pulled him out sooner, whether his own hunger to matter and to keep delivering made him deaf to the danger, whether the very drive that made him great also killed him. And in this reading, there is a family, Nadia and 3 children, who paid the price of a nation's advantage, who lost a husband and father to a rope in a foreign square and were never even allowed to bury him, whose grief has now stretched across generations with no grave to stand at. The state gained, the family lost everything, and the man himself, brilliant and brave and beloved and doomed, gambled his one life on a game the house always eventually wins. The truth, as with the deepest of these stories, is that both are true at once. He was a hero and he was a husband. He was a master of his craft and a man consumed by it. He saved lives he would never meet and shattered the lives closest to him. He made himself the most loved man in Damascus in order to betray it. And the same gift that lifted him to the summit would not let him climb down in time. He climbed so high that the enemy nearly made him one of their own. And the higher he climbed, the farther there was to fall. And in the end, he fell all the way in front of a cheering crowd in the heart of the city that had trusted him most. They welcomed a returning son and embraced him as one of their own. They never knew until the very end that the man they loved had come home to a country that was not his, to bring it down from the inside, and that he would give his life and his grave and never get either back. If a story like this one stays with you, stay with us. The most dangerous man in any room is the one everyone in it trusts.